Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you, Ann Arbor Library. Thank you, everybody in the room.
Yes, thank you so much. Petra, I understand you have a video that you'd like us to get started with to sort of set the mood.
Let's do that. Let's show the video.
Okay.
Thank you so much. We'd love to screen the first video. Thank you. A Huron River Seance from Diver Beneath the Street. Let's drift together. Watch this square yard of river run and run. Witness yourself watching and being with the water. Release hormones, pheromones. Send molecule to drift, drift over, drift toward the river, drift toward Lake Erie. Sun, wind, ice slides all year. All year you lose yourself to multitudes. Fragment, filaments, entangle with sticky water, with carbon dusted snow. PFAS, eternal elements cling to mercurial tension drop. Elongate. Do not let go. Clasp so hard to this spot. Slot in the bone, in the fatty tissue of the drop of the eyelid.
That's so lovely. You did the edit yourself.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Yay.
So I wanted to just start a little bit with the fact that you've been away for a year on a Guggenheim. And then also you mentioned in the preface that you are from a small village in Germany. And this is a very site-specific kind of writing. So I'm just really curious, how does place affect and intertwine with the way that you write?
Thank you. That is a really lovely question. I'm going to answer that in relation to the video that we just watched. So the video was shot right here on the River Huron, here in Ann Arbor. It was part of a workshop that we did as part of the Ann Arbor 200 anniversary, this project, the Ann Arbor 200 project. And a bunch of the people in the room here, actually, we were together and engaged with the river, and we were drifting by the river, which is one of the core methods that I'm using in this book and that I particularly used during COVID lockdown, so which is such an important part of the book. So the opposite of travel, right? I travel a lot, but so much of my experience is being in space and being in close up with space. As a disabled woman, as someone who lives with pain, both where I come from, small rural village in Germany, and also where I travel, which is often in rural spaces. I'm not really a very urban girl. I enjoy small meandering, small drifting. So here for this session that you just watched, a number of us, we were maybe 8, 9 people, we had our red camping chairs. You could see us. We had the circle of red camping chairs. And at one point, we had a pink flamingo blow-up toy, a giant flamingo called Mingo that we were playing with, and as well as a little dachshund that was at one point part of our drifting. And we just drifted and engaged with the bathers. This was in July. In the bathers by the side of the Huron River. We engaged with the kind of research that I had done around the Huron. So you've heard here mention of the PFAS, the eternal elements, the kind of toxic load that is part of the watershed thread here around where we live. Many of us here who live in Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti, the wider watershed, know of the plume of PFAS elements that's slowly creeping its way into our water. So these are the kinds of research questions that I'm trying to weave into my experiences of how I am walking on the soil. I'm trying to merge the histories of a place with my current somatic experience of being in this place. So both prior habitations, what I know of who's currently living on the land, with my own settler experiences of being this German woman, queer woman living on this place right now.
And you mentioned drifting as a method. So I'm curious about that. Is that special to you?
No. Drifting has a beautiful long history, a wonderful rich history that comes out of a surrealist practice. So there's this French word dérive, drifting, that comes out of a post-situationist history. I'm not going to unwrap all of that, not getting all academic, but it's a surrealist history that comes out of psychogeography. So, which is a beautiful word, psychogeography. How cool is that, right? So imagine psychogeography investigating the psychological, the kind of psychotherapeutic, the kind of narrativizing, the kind of free association practices that are part of walking on land, drifting on land. Just imagine, instead of talking freely, you're just experiencing freely as you're walking on the land. That is psychogeography. You are taking influence from the land. You're taking influence from the land and from the human-shaped environment that's created on the land. You're taking in and you're taking note of the rules that are created on the land. So it's not just an engagement with some kind of idea of pristine land. That doesn't exist anywhere. Instead, you are you'll be trying to become conscious, or at least dream-like conscious, of the rules that overlay the land. The rules of the quay, the wooden structures that are built by the river, the way that human pathways by the river have been created, how that might or might not relate to indigenous routes, how that might or might not relate to capitalist pathways of trade goods moving through space, of toxic loads, of borders, state borders, those kinds of questions, like both micro questions and macro questions of space and time, power and relations. All these sorts of things we can become permeable to those when we engage in psychogeography.
That's so interesting that you say microscopic and macroscopic, because one of my questions reading this book, this poetry is so granular, and it takes us from the microscopic to the macroscopic, and it's very rarely like super anchored for a long time in the world as we walk around in it every day in some ways. And so I'm really curious, like what does working in that realm offer you as a writer that like scholarly writing might not offer you, or even fiction or performance? What does this kind of granular thinking about the micro and the macro do for you?
Oh, that is such a lovely question. Oh, I just love the questions you ask. I just want to draw attention to the wonderful interlocutor you are. This is not the first time we're in dialogue, and every time you just throw these beautiful questions at me that make me really think about stuff. So,
Thanks.
love that. Because usually I get to answer questions by moving back to myself as a performance artist, and you're now like moving that one away from me and asking me, well, what is it that poetry allows me here? I love that. And I once again move to that space of pain, right? So pain means that I often find myself moving to the micro, right? So I'm thrown back to very small movements. You know, I might be in space, I might be out in my garden, I might be in my yard. So many of the poems are in my yard, right? Or in my neighborhood, very close by. And I am relatively immobile. My pain often means that I might just be sitting in my zero gravity chair, you know. I can sort of rule my world from my laptop. You know, I've learned how to do that. This is part of what it means to learn to lead an academic life, right? We're doing this stuff, right? But I am a dancer, and I really love being out in the world. So I have that yearning, and it's stifled because I cannot move. And the drifting that I can do through my micro movements and my reaching out my senses and just paying attention to this the very small scope that I have around me allows me to participate in a different kind of dance. And poetry allows me a different dance than critical writing or fiction can allow me, because it allows me that the non-connective, the specificity of that moment, this moment, and that moment, and this moment, and then the revisionary practices allows me to create connections and constellations. One of my favorite thinkers is Walter Benjamin. I am always an academic. I never go away from that, right? So, and with an academic, what I mean with that is I'm a citational person. I love creating webs, you know, webs of people. So here's Walter Benjamin who speaks about constellations, about how light from different stars reaches our eye at the same time. The stars may be long dead, and they will have died at different times, or they might be shining at really different times, but their light reaches us and my eye at the same time. Poetry has a quality like that. I can be that bundler of constellation. I can be that moment when these different things constellate within me. And I have that privilege of being this still moment where these things come together.
It makes me think of cultural rhetorics a little bit too, like constellations of thinking around different practices, different cultures, what those represent. I'm curious about your writing process for this book, part of which you started to talk about a little bit. Could you sort of take us from picking up that book at this library, right? To that was 2011, right? Okay, so could you take us from there to here? What all did that involve? Because you can gather some from the, you know, situated in your yard, situated in different places in Detroit or in Ipsy, but how did you as a writer work that process?
Yes. So this is another narrative, right? So there are some narratives. So there's sensations and then there's narratives. So one of the narratives of the book is that it's about the Michigan murders. So the Michigan murders is a book that came out in the 70s, and it was quite an important book for true crime writing, and it covers the Michigan murders, which happened between 1967 and 1969 here in this region. It's still a very, very well remembered series of murder cases in which young women, many of whom were students at Eastern Michigan University and University of Michigan. They were students here, and they were murdered. And their bodies were found in various locations around here, and some very close to where I live. And actually the murder house that led to the conviction of the murderer is in the street where my wife and I now live. And there's this whole story, is a really interesting, complicated story about how we came to know that, and how our neighbors were not telling us that until they figured out who we were, and that we actually would be interested in that kind of story, and then we found out more about it. So all these interesting ways in which rumor work, in which neighborhood connections work, and all of that is processed and metabolized in the book. But the way I first found out about all of this was indeed by being here at this library, in the free book area that's downstairs on the ground floor. There used to be carts. Now there's actually one cart still down there, but it only has a handful of books on it. But at one point there were lots of books, and it's all about transport nets. I've already mentioned transport nets earlier. I was taking a bus to the airport, and like many people, I walk into the library and grab a free book from the cart, and there was this book, The Michigan Murders, and then I read it and I was like fascinated by it, because it was all about a cultural framings of how women are allowed, how women are perceived to inhabit space, and not allowed to inhabit space, and are killed for inhabiting space. And so that became the impetus, the first impetus for gathering these poems of space, as I was visiting murder sites, both here in Ypsi, in Ann Arbor, and then during the 2019 serial killing that happened in Detroit, also in Detroit at various sites there. And those, working with these sites and working with the kind of composting of history, respect for the price women pay for traversing space, became one of the first seeds of this book.
Yeah. I like the metaphors you keep using too, of composting and seeds and all of that. And the book feels haunted by these women as you're reading it. And something you just said made me think about how the women's bodies in some ways were then taken back and building something beautiful, whether that beautiful thing is something growing out of the ground or whether it's a piece of art or whatever it is. Did you think about the women as part of the story itself, or did they become sort of a jumping off point?
That is always a very complicated question, right? Because women's bodies are so often material for other things. So being really careful not to engage concretely with women's bodies, and not to extract, not to become someone who extracts some stuff out of the death of beautiful women, which is an Edgar Allan Poe idea, right? This like the most beautiful thing is the death of a beautiful woman, or the death of a woman, is a complicated, it's a complicated issue at the heart of true crime writing. Yeah. The quote goes on in a different way, which has a really interesting queer connotation as well, about desire lines, and there's some really interesting rich material there that I've played with a lot in the creation of this book. And maybe we should move to the second video to kind of give a sense of how I play with that notion of composting into the earth, moving into the earth, and this giving oneself towards the river. You know, the rivering is another one of the poems along the Huron River. Should we do that?
Yeah, let's do it.
Great. So this is the second video poem, created in a similar way from the first one. Maceration, bubble gas. Green bone child. Rain drives nutrients into flow. Lake Erie's mouth sips bone broth. Trickles slow, earth child. Race with the storm, to rivering. To open. To dissolve. All right,
Greenbone Child.
Greenbone Child.
That title is so confounding to me. And that's kind of what I love about the poem, is that you have to just give yourself over to it instead of trying to figure it out in your head, which feels like a lot of this poetry, I think.
Definitions of poetry, I guess.
Yes, exactly. Associational links, yeah. How do you, or if you do, imagine your readers as you're writing? What do you want us to experience?
Yeah, well, that first video that I showed, and also the poem that of course it's based on, has this invitation of look at this square yard of earth, right? Or in the poem it was the square yard of river, right? So and in the book it's literally a square of writing, a square of poems. So I don't know that people can see this online, but here in the room you might be able to see that it's literally a square, you know. It's like I use forms on the page to create fields that one can wander in, I hope. So and I'm excited and interested in the idea of a reader going on a journey on the page and creating their own narrative. At times there are some pieces. There's the piece where you go wandering with the springtail, which I could read later, actually, if you maybe, you know, like the Halloween story.
Yes.
And there's like a little horror story where you go with a springtail under the earth and to a cathedral under the earth, which might or might not be a ribcage. You know, we can do that in a minute. But, you know, so some is kind of more narrative-y and goes a little bit into fiction territory. But some has a shape where you go wandering on the page. And I would and invite the reader to pay attention how words feel in their mouth, you know, how words shift in their body. You know, I hope some people might read something out loud, and there might be a cathedral in their own ribcage. Yeah. There might be sounds that travel and have different resonances. You know, the resonance in your own skull when you say a word and it resonates up here, or, you know, has a different feel when it is down here. So I'm really interested in that connection between sound and the spaces in our body.
Yeah. Does that translate for you into your scholarly writing as well?
Yes. Yes, it does. So my scholarly writing is on somatics,
Mhm.
embodiment, and the witnessing of performance. So
Nice.
both the creation of performance, arts-based research, and how I witness performances. And I invite my readers along into this. So in Ecosoma, which is my most recent academic book that you seem to be referring to here, yeah. That's very much what I do. There's many invitations to my reader to go with me in something, to become aware of how they're sitting in a chair and what they're sitting on and the
Right.
materials that we're sitting on. So that's very much the habitus, the invitation of my writing in general.
Yeah, that's great.
An active invitation. I invite active readership in each of the genres.
That seems really clear, especially in the poem that you in Greenbone Child. I felt as a reader kind of invited to read it in many directions and not necessarily one linear path, which seemed a lot of fun to me.
I love that. And I also really do, a lot of my practices is about getting people to write themselves. Not necessarily in this book, but a lot of my performance practices have elements where I literally invite people at some point to write themselves. Like the beautiful things that we did there together at the end of each of those, we wrote, right? I mean, again, some people are in the room who are part of this, and and we did end up writing. Many of the people are wonderful poets in their own right, and performance artists.
Do you get people there who are neither poets nor performance artists?
Yep.
What happens when you do? How do they take it?
Oh, we end up having a nice drink afterwards as well.
It's a strange place, I think, as any audience member to be called upon to participate in
Yes.
ways that are outward,
Yeah,
you know.
that's true.
Which
Yeah.
is really exciting.
It's not necessarily with an audience, right? So it's not necessarily towards sharing.
Right.
I mean, it can be very, very internal writing and held for ourselves.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So how often do you have other people's eyes on your poetry as you're drafting, revising, all of that?
Well, I think, like many poets, it's, most poets are not really star vehicles, right? That's not really a thing for most of us, right? Not really happening. I mean, very, very occasionally it happens, but it's not really for most of us. Many of us, I think, work in a community context. We write for each other, with each other. I think most of my poems get read by other poets in workshop situations. So my wife, who's also a poet and who's here, hello, Stephanie, hi. We both are part of a lovely circle of people, an ecopoetry group. So we meet once a month and we write poems, we read them to each other, we critique them. So when we meet up, we critique poems. There's another poet here who's also a dear friend, and we do submission parties together, right? So, I mean, this is also a part of poetry life, to just submit stuff together. Someone else is here that I write with as well. So, this is very common that you just write, you're in writerly life together. And so that is, I think, for me, a definition of most poets. It's not so much hoarding your poems and then they go to the publisher and then you become this breakout superstar. That'd be nice, but, really not usually the case.
Yeah.
Most of the time, it's the act of writing and the act of a poetry life, of an art life, a poetry life, that is what most of us are striving for, to be in a community where someone reads the work and then has wonderful questions like you, like this is to me a rich poetry life, to be in conversation, to be in engagement, to have places that host us. Here in Hamtramck a few weeks ago, in the future online spaces, other kinds of poetry spaces. It's a circuit. It's a small circuit. Like later on at the end of October, a number of us are hosting a disability arts and culture gathering where we have disabled poets and performers and dancers from the region and from further beyond come here, and we're working at the Matei Botanical Garden and at the Ann Arbor Art Center and at Turtle Disco, the little place that Stephanie and I are running at Ypsilanti. So people will share poems, will share practices. That is really where most of this kind of stuff will see the light of day.
That's so wonderful. I wish every single one of my students could hear you say that, because I think that a lot of times students feel like they're writing into a void, or like the point is the finished product instead of the point being the process. And you're currently teaching a class on eco-criticism?
I teach a class called Queer Feminist Eco Art Practices.
Oh, okay.
Which is delightful. Which is so beautiful.
Yeah.
Oh, that's just lovely. And so that is very much in practices. It's very much about the processes.
Right.
So, and that's what I'm really trying to engage the students with. That is the process. It's not about the finished product. It's we're really very much paying attention to what it is that we are metabolizing as we are engaging in these processes together. We read material every week. We read a lot of some of the stuff that we were talking about earlier on, some of the psychogeographical material that tells us about who's been excluded from discussions of landscape, who has not been thought about, which people are not seen as having ownership of natural spaces. So we read this material, and instead of discussing it, we're also discussing it, but instead of mainly discussing it, we're engaging in practices that put us in embodied ways into that landscape, and then pay attention to what happens in that more holistic engagement with this work.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's such a tradition of, whether it's nature writing or poetry, there's such a tradition of observation that people talk about a lot, and also find really difficult to do in some ways. So when you're observing the world around you, I'm thinking about, for instance, the Detroit poem. The image that's sticking in my head is of the red rusted lock on the door. So do you experience a space, do some writing, and then go to research to try to find out more about that space? Is it more back and forth between the research and the drafting? How does that all work for you?
Back and forth, both. Shall I read that, maybe?
Let's
to give
do.
people a sense.
Yeah.
And that is actually interesting that you mentioned that one in particular. The other class I'm currently teaching is it's called Eco Imaginations, and that is a class that is an art of film class. So it's in the English department. Trying to do two things at once, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. It works. Here it is. It's cross-listed in English and in film studies, actually, and we are both making films and then writing both about our own films and about other material, eco-media work that we're finding. We're doing close analysis, and we're writing in class together, and everybody's reading what everybody's writing at the same time. So we have like a Google Doc that the whole class writes into, which is really cool. So it gets we're creating a lot of textual material, so it doesn't get so precious. A lot gets created, a lot gets looked at the same time. And that is really how this kind of work can get created. You know, like it comes out of close analysis in some ways. And this is close analysis of being in space as a camera. Yeah. Coventry Street, Detroit. And it has an epigraph, which means, I don't know. Epigraph means that it's a different kind of writing. It's a quotation at the top. The epigraph is, the black mold fungus, Trachobotris chatarum, was originally discovered on the wall of a house in Prague in 1837. The average person inhales at least 40 conidia fungus spores per hour. Okay. All right. So we're all inhaling fungus spores. Think about that. Permeability is very much going on in this book. All right. So now the poem starts. Coventry Street, Detroit. Action. I zoom into the vulnerable opening, quiver shot. Curb is a bump, tender green clad, a carpet thick, dry patches, razor burn. Over the occluded lines of sidewalk, grey engraving into riotous weeds. Sun shines on my back, birdsong in the city. My world smells open, rain fresh, steaming. My lens finds the first stoop. Cut. Pan to the banister. Peel. Skin flakes. Dry. Long strips. Old paint emulsified. Durable metal. Lead resists moisture for a time. Now fragment, fly, get away, fly with the wind, disseminate, go. Action. Sneakered foot crashes through splintery wood, rebalance. A teenager's locks billow into my viewfinder. Crashes echo finds bird wing beat, beat inside, crawl, clamor. Cut. A heavy lock. Red rusty closed hasp, over medium density plywood, door shaped, window shaped, anchored against release. Action. A mold spore winks through the crack between the crumbly window frame and new board, angles at a cocky tilt into the wind. Cellulose sated, the fungus spore twirls, scents, drifts toward damp, the open, and slips with heaving sigh down toward inner tree. Branches welcome to tiny endpoints, round apples wet and shaken with oxygen's embrace. It binds itself to the wall. A painting, memory of a home, nods on its growing stalk. Cut. Camera on the back of teenager on the move. Laughter peals in my ears. Race to the next delivery station.
That's so lovely.
Thank you.
I love that it moves from your inner experiences and observations to the outer, and that sort of conceit, I guess, of the movie making with that. What makes you choose to say, I'm going to represent this as though it's a movie? Like, what made that choice for you?
We had a question earlier about murder sites.
Right.
So this is a murder site.
Mm-hmm.
So that answers that question. This is very much a mixed up of a murder site and TV conventions of how to represent murder sites, CSI, crime scene investigations, spores, penetrations, and then whom I find moving through space as I drift through the city.
Yeah, I think that plays out really beautifully in there. I am curious also how you find new projects. So this one I know sort of found you. Is that how it typically works? Or do you have a certain attention out for new things?
Well, I think they all, interesting question. They do develop one into the next, into the they're morph. I think my projects usually are years long. So I mentioned this one is like 20, what did I say? 2011. 2011 is when I found that book. I mean, there's been a bunches of other projects along the way, but they kind of just, something just stays and grows and moves, and then this comes forward and this shifts back, and they're all related. I mean, they're all one giant, big, long, ongoing art life project.
Yes, meditation.
A long meditation that has just different growth points. So I could show you what I'm currently going on with, so a little bit, so another film, just because it's nice to break up the media.
Let's do.
So I am now working on a project called Planting Disabled Futures, which is a virtual reality project, which is not what I'm showing you now, because we don't have 3D glasses here. But over this summer, I had a residency at the Huntington Gardens out in Southern California. And I am working with fellow disabled people in garden sites, which again, super related to what I'm doing in here, obviously. And we are touching plants and hanging out with plants. And that is literally what I'm doing now with this VR project. So yesterday I had a lovely meeting with my development team, my 3D developing people, and they showed me the first, the first prototype of this tree that we're developing, and the tree will have portals, and in those portals will be some of the videos that I just showed you. The 2 videos will be in the portals, for instance. Other people's poems, videos, audio journeys, my own audio journeys will be in the portals. So the projects will begin to merge. I just want to show you one of the minutes, maybe, just to get a sense of what an like an embodied audio description piece looks like. So it's less a poem, but a other like different kind of genre.
Planting disabled futures. Traces of 14 encounters at the Huntington Gardens, Hamamogana, Tongvaland, May, June 2024.
I am touching a bamboo. It feels like someone has written something here, and I don't know what that is. And I feel the texture of bamboo really interesting to me. But I can't find a leaf. Here is the leaf. Bamboo reminds me of home. That's why I love bamboo. And I'm touching the leaves one by one.
Lovely. And we can just stop that here.
Green
Thanks
leaf
so much.
twer-
Yeah. So that gives you a sense of where it's going, and the virtual reality world will be in a live performance environment. So there'll be a crypt cave, which will have 2 virtual reality places. You have like a zero gravity chair. I already mentioned a zero gravity chair for my garden, right? So we'll have 2 of those in the crypt cave. So you have your headset. There will be a performer who will introduce you to a virtual headset if you never had one. It will help you set yourself up. One of the performers will offer you haptic objects, which will likely be a mixture between probably seaweed and maybe forest material with digital elements. I don't know yet what I'm saying because the person that is creating those is telling me wonderful things about it, but none of us know yet exactly what it will be like. That is Moira Williams, who's a fabulous collaborator, and I'm very excited about what they're going to create.
Yeah.
We'll have a STEM tent that Moira is working on. We just will have all these wonderful elements in there. I'm very excited about it. And the VR journey will have a pathway that is where you go on this journey and up and down the tree through visual controls, like the way that someone who's visual, like myself, will go on, like what is considered normal in a virtual environment. But then there will also be a pathway that's completely audio. So I'm currently actually recording a kind of poetic pathway that is completely audio. So I'm trying to do this with a poet's imagination of how to do that that's both informative, that get you somewhere, but is also aware of what it means to follow a poet's voice to a particular location in a virtual reality.
Wow.
So yeah, that is very fun and a challenge because I have to do it to the timeline of the developer, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Like there's deadlines,
Yeah.
which is not something a poet usually has to deal with.
It's probably true. I'm noticing that we have a few minutes left. Would you like to make some time for questions or read some more first?
Maybe should I just read that one poem, the one I
Yeah,
mentioned, and then we have time for Q&A, right? How about that?
Great. That's perfect.
So because I had promised that, so I should better do it, I think. So this is a Halloween poem.
Yay.
So So The Bread is the name of this piece, and it also has an epigraph, and that's from Camille Dangy, from The Body Was Dirt, and this is the epigraph. But was it ever small like that, the first body? Did it ever sit close to the ants and their piles of dirt from which that body had come? And now comes the actual poem, The Bread. The bread, Smell the moist hunk of it, abandoned by the side of the street near the chiropractor's door. Just step toward it, over to the apple tree. Fermentation is in the air. Look close and see worm wriggle just beneath the cheek blush. The bread swells out, pores open, breath full. The bag has burst wetly, white holes and grains spill like dandelion fluff from plastic webs. Cider sour mold stains squashed grass. Follow decay juice down. Gravity pulls to the strata of tiny springtails, hexapod microorganisms which each squish a chip of white-green mold bread compound down to their caverns, through cave tunnels between loose crumbles of soil. Make friends. Wave at her compound eye. See yourself reflected in the last dying light. There you are, so many times, as she munches her treasure in peace. A giant earthworm moves by you two, majestic and pink. This corer leaves a round hole for Springtail and you to follow. Earth grows dark. Springtail nods at family deep below. Colorless carapace auntie, long having abandoned surface ways. Auntie's sisters make a wreath in the round cave or portal. Will you step through? That fluff of ever-greener bread you drag slithers across antennae, translucent torsos where pale hemolymph pump through the dorsal vessel's thickening pipe. Beyond the portal, a cathedral opens. Phosphorus lights on beetles' back ends reveal a cavern. You scan a ripped vault, earth packed tight as moist clay between bony stays. A rumble ahead. You follow the sound wave with your devolving eyes. Your midline pings out in response. Ears travel inward. Your feet are gone. Deep in the cavern, a skitter. Crackle, thump, thump, bass note. Ground beetles, wings long atrophied, scratch against one another in a round heap. A horde, 100 bodies deep and more. Constant motion, mandibles out and rasping. The ball resonates against the overhead arcs of ribs. The vault that once housed lungs massages this mass now. Motion, sound vibrations, a roar in the earth. Transformation. You approach this beat, this push, with your disaggregate of wilted, moldy bread. Drips of vinegary moisture mark the brown earth pack where you crawl until the ball rears right here. Beetle sharpness of waxy chitin armor wave at you as they plow under, over, never tire. Jaws that reach deep into the coil of a snail, extract a last cling of flesh, leave behind a tiny porcelain jewel between giant vertebrae cemented into the ground. 40 antennae. Then 90 mandibles, then too many razor legs reach forward toward you, toward your hand, your tentacle, that sensitive pad, pluck the fuzzy weeping bread mold offering. Metallic clicks mesmerize, then tick over you. The carrier pluck and pull. You see large beetle eyes close, so close. Antennae caress every micrometer. Invite, breathe, recycle, compost. Each breath, till you are inside. Embrace.
Thank you.
Halloween poem.
I love it. Spooky season is upon us. That's perfect. So, time for questions?
Absolutely. All right. If anyone has any questions, I will pass you the mic so that our friends who are streaming can hear it.
That last poem was so wonderfully fast-paced, but I think a different vibe for the rest of the poems in the book on the whole. Your work generally has a way of slowing me as a reader way down, which is something I really like and appreciate about it. And I'm wondering it's such a beautiful counterpoint, given the subject of the book, to how when these events happened, they were portrayed and talked about in the media, the quickness of tabloids, what didn't exist then. What did we call clickbait before the internet was? Trashy headlines or something, right? So I just want to say that, but I also just want to ask you about the tempo of this work, and if it just seems, and you did such a careful job of not objectifying these women, right, by taking it down to the granular, the very small, thinking about the ways this life force continues. So to me, it feels like, there's some piece of justice in that time, even. But what does that time feel like or mean to you? Is this a bad question? I don't know.
It's a lovely question. I think it's beautiful. Thank you. I think the poems that are at the heart of the two videos answer that temporality much better maybe than this Halloween poem. Because yes, that slowing down and the observing that I talked about when I'm sitting and I'm just paying attention. The other part that we didn't really talk about too much was the COVID time beat, the lockdown period. I'm not talking about the fact that we're still in COVID time and that lots of us are still having their masks here, having them around our necks right now. I'm talking about the lockdown period and when so many of us were thrown into our backyards and into our neighborhoods because that's the only space that was available to us. And so we had that time of scrutiny. I mean, I learned so much about the plants of my neighborhoods just because I was looking at the yards, the garden plants in a very different way. I mean, my wife is a wonderful gardener, and I now know a lot more about gardening just by paying attention to what she's paying attention to. But during that period, I also found myself being much more engaged with that. And I was paying attention to soil breakdown. I was paying much more attention to life and death cycles. So the clickbait situation and the changed temporality of the pandemic moved together in a really complicated way for me at that time, as death was near us in many different ways. I speak about my own COVID experience at the time, which did not result in death. I'm sitting here, but which was very terrifying at the time, before vaccines, before I actually had even a diagnosis. I'm speaking about other near-death experiences as a disabled woman in this book. So, this book is also very much about reckoning with death, both other women's experiences and my own experiences in different ways, and slowing down and paying attention to life and its emergence and its decay is part of what the book is about to me. Thank you.
I think it's so interesting you asked about pace, because pace was really on my mind also. But I think I maybe want to either ask a question or make a word association in the hopes that you might respond around pace and process. I also experienced just that slowing in reading the poetry. And I'm wondering practically what that looks like in the context of being someone who is also situated in academia, which is a very fast-paced, product-driven world. And I think I'm asking in a sort of practice sense, in like a literal, what do you do? How do you build that space? But then also a maybe philosophical, political, activist sense too.
Thank you. Yes. So that is also very interesting. Of course, to me, sitting on this side of things, right? I am a full professor at this point, right? So I am very aware of the privilege from which my answer comes here. For me, an academic and a artistic life is one of deliberation and is one of slowness. I mean, yes, I answer a lot of emails, There's that. So the emails are fast and a little bit annoying. I mean, they're pretty annoying. A little bit. Did I say a little bit? No. This is like.
By which you meant a lot.
By which I mean a lot. That was just a very polite way of saying like freaking annoying. But my real work and the work of both my critical writing and my creative work are actually a work of slowness. I mean, when I am doing my, when I'm engaged in my critical writing, which some people might see as my more academic writing, I see them all completely related and interpenetrated, and I don't really have a distinction there at this point. But even when I'm doing that, which some people might consider my more academic work, it's contemplative. I mean, it's deeply contemplative. And I think that is true of most of my colleagues' work. I mean, I just came from the Hibberly lecture in the English department, and I witnessed a speaker give a wonderful talk about the power of close reading and black reading, which was all about deep attentiveness and deep being with both, both primary text and critical attention. And it was very much about stepping outside a temporality of production and into a temporality of paying attention. So I think there actually are relatively few jobs that require you to slow down. And yes, it's true that the academic machinery, the machinery that has nothing to do with academia, which is called administration, requires us to not do that. But I think some of us are more situated than others due to the relative privilege within that machinery to insist that the job of academia is the contemplative one, right? So, yeah, it behooves us to remember that and to argue for that on behalf of those who do not have the privilege to advocate for that in quite the same way. So I think there's a reason why in this country at least, and I'm not from this country, I am German, I come from a very different place with a very different tradition, but in this country at least there's a reason why so many artists are also associated in some way or the other with the academy, because this is one of the places where there is at least somewhat of a space for that kind of contemplative mode. And when I say contemplative, I do also mean activist contemplative.
Okay, I do think we are out of time, but I want to thank you both so much for being here and our audience. Can we give a final round of applause?
Thanks for being wonderful. That was
my
great.
Goodness. Thank you for inviting me. It really means a lot.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, people online.